In the history of Marvel Comics, I don't believe any hero has garnered so much love and admiration quite like the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Being young, relatable, and morally admirable, it's no wonder that the Wallcrawler has been able to maintain a steady following even in recent years. And so when the spider-centric Marvel Comics event, Spider-Verse, was released in late 2014, not only was it fun for readers to see the newly revived Spider-Man have his own Spider-tastic celebration event, but it was also fascinating for both new and old readers to see a collection of spider-themed heroes that spanned both time and space in the Marvel Universe. Where some fans saw a devaluation of the Spider brand through a series of remixes and reimaginings of the beloved hero, many others saw fascinating and new opportunities in storytelling and perspectives towards the one and amazing Spider-Man that we all know and love. And so with this sort of schism between reactions to the grandiose Spider event in mind, I think there's a certain conversation to be had concerning the core idea of these spider-themed characters. What makes a spider hero? Now, the central plot of Spider-Verse isn't too important for this dissection of language and definition, but there are some very key scenes that help add to the conversation. After all, I believe it would be stretching the levels of credulity to have the story completely play out without some sense of self-awareness towards the fact that most every spider character feels like some sort of parody or remix of each other. In fact, writer Dan Slott even takes the time to explore the potential for a sense of existential crisis with one of the more down-to-earth spider-themed heroes, Pavitra Pabaka. Similarly, the Spider-Verse tie-in series, Scarlet Spiders, also explores the notion of defining spider heroes by comparing the clones Ben Reilly, Kane, and the Jessica Drew of the Ultimate Universe to the original Peter Parker as a foundation for definition. However, as nice as it was to have a variety of members of the Spider-Man mythos assemble for an action-packed adventure, there was definitely one rather nitpicky aspect of the Marvel event that left many readers confused or dissatisfied. What exactly decides whether a person is considered to be a spider totem? The definition and criteria is left incredibly vague, perhaps even intentionally so, which is certainly odd considering this is literally what acts as the motivation for all these heroes' plunge into the multiversal war. Well, one connecting thread that may exist amongst every protagonist of the story may be that they are all versions of Peter Parker. Like both Ben Reilly and Kane, both of which are clones of Peter Parker, the Peter Parker of the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon series, and Superior Spider-Man, a version where Doc Ock exists inside the body of Peter Parker. But this Peter Parker commonality isn't true for all of the spider heroes that we find in the story, as we see plenty of heroes who aren't Peter Parker, such as Miles Morales, the Ultimate Spider-Man, Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man of 2099, and Gwen Stacy's Spider-Gwen. Okay, so then how about we try again and try to find a better definition for a denizen of the Spider-Verse? How about a radioactive spider bite as the shared commonality? Well, unfortunately this doesn't work out for all the heroes either, as we have Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, Spider-Girl Anya Corazon, and Spider-Ham, who was bitten by a radioactive pig rather than a spider. Well then, how about people with the word spider in their name? But again, we're leaving out the character Silk, who is too integral to the core of the story for us to rule her out as part of the definition. All in all, there doesn't seem to be a single commonality that each protagonist shares amongst the total plot. And this would typically lead us to conclude that there simply can't be a definition for what a spider person is. However, over a century ago, a certain Austrian philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein happened upon this very same problem, and he decided to take a very sensible approach to resolving this dilemma of definition. Now, for context, in his earlier years, Wittgenstein was determined to mathematize language. He wanted us to use mathematical logic to express conversational language and help us reach truthful and understandable conclusions. However, in his later years, Wittgenstein strayed away from this idea of language through math, because he saw the issues with defining the more vague ideas in language. Nevertheless, he came to his own conclusion on definitions in language in his posthumously published essay, Philosophical Investigations. To help explain his ideas, Wittgenstein decided to ask how we define games. He points out the fact that there are a wide variety of activities that we would all agree to be games, and yet there doesn't seem to be much of a unifying factor that helps us formally grasp the definition of what a game is. Well, one might say that it's a win-or-lose activity. Well, then what about games with the third option of stalemate, like tic-tac-toe? Or games that refuse the idea of winners or losers altogether, like a puzzle game or a jigsaw? Others might say it's an activity with a specific objective. Well, this definition doesn't exactly work either, since we now have an entire genre of sandbox games where they kind of go against the idea of objective-based gameplay. And lastly, one might generally just say that it's just an activity where you have fun. Well, especially in recent years with the advent of video games, there's an entire genre of games dedicated to the idea of suffering or raging out from the activity. And so I think this criteria isn't as applicative as it might have been in Wittgenstein's time. In Wittgenstein's own words, how should we explain to someone what a game is? I imagine that we should describe games to him, and we might add, this and similar things are called games. And do we know any more about it ourselves? But this is not ignorance. As Wittgenstein points out, it's reasonable to try and define words or ideas by listing examples, instead of giving a single definition. And to explain, or at least give a name to this phenomenon in language, where a word's examples seem to overlap rather than share one single commonality, Wittgenstein proposed the notion of definition coming from family resemblance. Much as how members of a single family tend to share specific traits or characteristics across all of their members rather than a single distinct one, Wittgenstein insists that definition in language can in fact come from a network of similarities. Now, this can all sound very esoteric and difficult to follow, so to help give a visual metaphor of his explanation of family resemblance, Wittgenstein likened the phenomenon to a piece of thread. But for the sake of bringing the discussion back to Spider-Verse, I'll be using a web instead. The web as a whole represents the word or idea that's being defined, and each different fiber in the web represents the many different examples that can come from the word that we're using. Now, the moments where the fibers in the web overlap are the moments where we spot patterns between the examples we've listed. In Wittgenstein's own words, the strength of the thread, or web, does not reside in the fact that some one fiber runs through the whole length, but rather in the overlapping of many fibers. Through this interpretation, definition can be understood as a geometric tapestry. And I think that's beautiful. Now, returning to the original discussion of the Spider-Verse event, there are still disagreements on what really qualifies as a spider hero. Some fans may prefer spider heroes who are just different versions of Peter Parker. Others may prefer ones given the radioactive spider bite. And it's alright to have preferences. But what some people have gone so far as to say is that giving the label of spider hero to characters who don't meet their personal criteria devalues the characters that they like the most. Now, this gatekeeping mentality honestly limits not only language, but discussion as a whole. And as Wittgenstein shows us with his thread and web metaphor, having a wider variety of definitions can actually empower the words that we're defining. It's important to have a sort of open mind towards language and definition, because it allows us not only to calm fan quarreling, but also be more considerate of what qualifies as games or even art. Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance is a very powerful theory. It's a constructive approach towards language instead of a destructive one. Instead of getting rid of what doesn't share a single trait, he considers the many similarities across all definitions. And as a man who once thought that conversation could be reduced to symbolic logic, this consideration of the humanity behind language, words, and ideas is rather inspiring. When it comes to language, I hope we can all calm down and be appreciative, as Wittgenstein was, of the human tendency to spot and admire patterns.